This interview is supplemental material to a class looking at the work and impact of illustration and Disney art legend Mary Blair. The class is called Chasing Mary, and if you like what you hear, feel free to follow the link below to learn more about her work and how we can learn from Chasing Mary. Ira, go ahead and tell us about your work.
Yeah, I'm mostly a cartoonist, so I'm kind of a mix of an author and illustrator. And I work in like a kid-friendly kind of style, but then, there's darker tones in my illustration work as well. And a lot of that, which I'll get into, kind of comes from the world of Mary Blair.
Cool. Well, when did you discover Mary's work? Was that in school or was that while you were working on something? Because I think we were all somewhat aware of her work without knowing it, right?
Yeah, right. It was kind of just a presence in your childhood. I'm 37 and I grew up until I was I spent like ages 5 through 8 living in Daytona Beach, Florida, which is right outside Orlando, Florida. So I'd been to Disney World a bunch, and that Disney vibe was a big part of my life. And if you know anything about, like kind of the Peter Pan era of Disney, like Mary Blair was an up-and-coming artist there, and by the time those projects got off the ground, she was like one of the main concept artists. So I had like the kids' book of the Peter Pan Disney story, but it was all like the Mary Blair concept art. And then, of course, the It's a Small World ride is all based on her design. So it's basically like a living gallery of her work. So between those two things, she was like a constant presence in my mind as a kid.
And now that I know who she is, then I go back and I'm amazed at how many things I was gravitating towards that. Oh, it's another Mary influenced thing right there. Which movie took you the most? I'm an Alice in Wonderland girl, so that's kind of typical.
Oh yeah. I love Alice in Wonderland was great. I guess maybe Peter Pan, because the adventure was a little more action-packed. So I think that drew me a little more. And I guess just as a kid, like as a young boy, like pirates and things like that and giant crocodiles was all cool. And then, like Alice, it's kind of like about being whisked away to a magical world. But that had the flying element, so that really sold me.
You wish you could fly.
I'm in. Yeah.
Cool. So how has her work influenced you? Can you pinpoint that?
I guess overall, she's such an icon of that 50s minimal, kind of flat, geometrical, but like really appealing, friendly style. But the way she kind of brought that in, like if you look at a lot of her work, I don't know how to put it exactly. If it's like the Dutch design, just like kind of simple kind of grids with circles and just clean lines. It almost looks like gouache or like other dry brush techniques or like stamping. A lot of those textures were really familiar because I'd see them on like dishcloths in my kitchen and stuff like that. And I think the 70s kind of brought that back a little bit. But then when I looked at her work, it was like a combination of all those basic geometries, but then there was like a narrative element, especially in the kind of concept art that's like what I added to the folder, a bunch of the Peter Pan stuff specifically. I'll start with my favorite image, which in that folder, it's called like Blair Peter Pan 13. It's like, it looks like a big cosmic scene, but it's just a view of the Neverland Island. So this image for me as a kid was, I don't know, there's just something like so magical about it. It's kind of map-like in that it's a zoomed out kind of flat isometric view, but it's also got like this nice cosmic coolness surrounding it and that like purple glow. So I just always loved this image. It's just, I guess overall, like for her work, the thing I always loved about it is it's so design driven, meaning it's got like a great balance of positive and negative space. Like she's just a master of bringing the right amount of darkness, especially if you're a kid. Like I love Peter Pan for the danger of it. Like you kind of feel like he's a cute character and the world is cute, but he also might get killed at any moment. The way she did the concept art, even though the film kind of takes the, they Disneyify it. It looks like a Disney cartoon. It doesn't quite look like Mary Blair art, but I feel like the darkness of the story, like she really pushed through her concept art. And that image specifically, I love the darkness of it. And I always loved maps, and specifically her little Neverland map, which I put in there also, which it looks kind of like a tourist map of a place that doesn't exist, because it's got all like the iconography of the different areas. And I put one of my maps in the folder as well. It's just so fun to make up places like this. Like everything's on a small island, so you can't really be overwhelmed with it. And they're all kind of just fun, simple ideas. Like you've got the Skull Rock, and then you've got the kind of little Native American village and the little like mermaid lagoon, and all these things that just kind of evoke your imagination, even without knowing the rest of the story. So being, 5 or 6, I couldn't really read these books, but I could tell myself the story of the world just through her designs. So yeah, that was always a massive part of it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And then you were saying that her Peter Pan work influenced something that you worked on. Yeah.
So I wrote a book called The Aquarium Drift. I usually do comics and cartooning, but this is a time where I strayed away from that. And I wrote like a short, kid-friendly adventure novel about a sailor who sails to the edge of the world in search of a giant sea serpent. And it's very kind of Peter Pan world-ish. And just her style, like I guess I could say like the angle of the camera she chooses to use a lot of the time. Everything has like a flatness to it. You're kind of outside viewing. And like, for example, I've got an image here it's called Blair 4 in the folder. So like a scene of Captain Hook, and I can't remember his sidekick's name.
Smee?
Yeah, Smee. Captain Hook and Smee are kind of like venturing into the forest, and it's this kind of like overcast night scene, and the boat's there in the bottom left-hand corner, and you've got these like flat rocks in the foreground, and they're entering just in through this perfect little like glowing shape that's overgrown by this kind of like menacing hand of a tree. Just the way she evokes a little bit of danger in her scene, but it's also like so playful. Like the brush strokes are so loose and friendly, and that dry brush texture. And it's got the darkness, but it also there's always like I don't know, for me, purple is always like a big color with her, like her kind of use of, it's like a softer, dull purple and kind of like a magenta. I bring that to a lot of my stuff too. And that book is like full of that color. So I don't know, as a kid, that color was one I always associated with her, like black, and then like rich purple is kind of a highlight. So that's something I used a lot, and just so much great little geometry. There's a scene here of this kind of like a little dance around a campfire. And I feel like that's a great use of like her design techniques. Those big wispy kind of flowy lines they're sort of like leftover from Art Nouveau, but then they're also very graphical. She's using them in the smoke, but they also make this kind of like nice pattern. And the image is kind of symmetrical, and the landscape is it looks like a block of cheese that's been like cut in half. I love that, and I totally like steal that all the time. You can see in a couple designs of mine, there's a scene with somebody at the top of a waterfall, and it's that same kind of angle, and the rocks below are all very like kind of cheese blocky.
Well, that's good to hear your process, because of the 3 areas that I'm talking about in the class, her use of color, an obvious favorite, and shape. The third being, I'm honestly having a hard time figuring out one word to put it. It's like the atmosphere, the ambiance, or the composition, or the landscape or mood that there are in her pieces. And that's what you're talking about. So,
there's mystery to it. Like there's a lot of like hidden elements. Like not everything is fully obvious in her designs. Like she adds like the right amount of detail. Like there's a little image here. I don't know. For me, this kind of encompasses what we're talking about here. Like it's Captain Hook's going into like the Skull Rock, and it's this big, like menacing skull. But the way she makes the shape and the amount of texture she uses, it's still kind of like friendly and soft. It looks like a big, like marshmallow, but it's big, scary, like Skull Rock that kind of looks like, I don't know. It's just evokes like a different era of visual art. Like, it's just like this big, dark, kind of menacing, overcast shape. Mm-hmm. But it's also kid friendly.
Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, I think the best artists are able to walk a line, and create a tension that just feels harmonious. And that would be like that danger, but it's kid friendly. It's colorful, but it's still masculine or whatever. I think, not that manly can't be colorful, but you understand what I mean. I honestly have a hard time with manly looks, so I admire that. Anyway, so if you were to describe, I mean, we've already done this somewhat or a lot, Mary's work, how would you describe it to someone who thinks they haven't seen it before?
Yeah, I don't know. For me, it's like a perfect mix of like graphical but illustrative. Like you can recognize the shapes and you can kind of enter into the scene. They feel like an illustration, like they tell a story, but there's also like this great appealing graphicalness. Like she's really great with silhouette. Things feel kind of cut out by hand. Like a scene of like a city skyline. It's never quite perfectly even. It's always kind of has like this rhythm and flow to it. It feels like very handmade, but it's also graphical and everything's in the perfect place. So it's well planned, but then there's always a whimsy to it. So I don't know. For me, and I think that's what makes her great at doing something like adapting Alice in Wonderland or Peter Pan. There are all these stories with like deeper, heavy meanings to them that they're there if you want to look. But there's also just like a friendly whimsy that's there. But it's also perfectly planned if you like dig into the design. So yeah, in my mind, those stories and her work, they just are locked together forever.
That's neat. Yeah, that on the surface for a child, you see it one way, and you can almost grow up into it and see more in her work. How cool is that? Yeah.
And then like in the Small World ride, like is going. I don't know if you've ever been on that. The Small World, like you're traveling through different parts of the world, and all the characters. They're simple geometries, but she evokes a lot of the culture through like the design patterns that they use. So speaks to her kind of like background as like a visual designer, looking at the iconography that originates in different parts of the world and how to just put that on display and have it all kind of like fit and be unified in some way. Like it's just so brilliant. I couldn't think of a lot of artists that are able to kind of like speak all these like visual languages, but still united under their own style. So that was probably one of the most impressive things, the way she can kind of represent different types of people, but still like bring it all under the banner of Mary Blair. So.
You said so many awesome things about Mary Blair. What would be one thing that you'd be happy for people to draw from in your work or say about your work?
Boy.
I know.
I think it's just that overall, the elements of design that you can bring to illustration, like that balance of light and dark is kind of, to me, the core of graphic arts. And I studied graphic arts in college. Like I thought I was going to be a designer, but I got back to like cartooning illustration. So I always appreciate the balance of light and dark, whether it's like visually or narratively. And I'm always trying to do that with my work. So I think that's what I always want people to take away from my stuff is things are equally both. Like a good kid story doesn't need to be on the brighter side of things. There needs to be like the darker thing to kind of balance out the good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Juxtaposition.
Yeah.
Very cool. Cool. Wow. I feel like I'm hearing you talk and I'm having this like back reel thinking about chewing on some of the things you said. So I'm having a hard time thinking of questions because it's so fun to think about. Yeah, to see her work through different lenses. Have you seen her work being not or have you seen her inspiring other artists? Like, are you able to look around and be like, hey, I bet they know Mary Blair right there?
Yeah, I think like we were saying earlier, it's like even if you don't, you probably grew up with her in some way or other. She's just such like a prominent designer was associated with like massive properties like through Disney. Like Disney really kind of like introduced her to the world in a lot of ways, and then you dig in. And I think just something about her aesthetic, that blend of like 50s, 60s design and the gouache technique, they're all so, just timeless and trendy at the same time. Like they're very hip. Like a lot of digital artists still embody like these textures. Like we're still trying to recreate them through like our digital tools. And she was just such an accessible artist with all those techniques. She just like had the perfect style that's just kind of rolled over and stayed relevant. And yeah, especially like her use of colors. They're just so great. Like the way she uses teal, like I put an image in here of like the fire dance scene. And it's not like just your conventional giant bonfire. It's like yellow on the outside and then turns teal on the inside, and the surrounding elements are orange. So it's just like, so brilliant. It's kind of surreal. Like it's so designy. It's just cool.
Like who would think of that?
Yeah, her, I guess.
Yeah. I would say what I admire, if I had to distill it, would be that she's very unabashedly herself, and I think that's what we all strive to be. But we want to look at these other artists and be inspired by them, and yet still carry our style. So in the class, I'm going to address a little bit about that. As we're looking at someone's work, it's easy to want to mimic it. And what's that fine line between copying and being inspired by, and learning from someone by doing exactly what they did, and learning from someone by looking at it and trying to distill what it is we love about it and what we're going to carry out of it. How do you approach that? I mean, walk that line of it, whether it be Mary or anyone else, like, I love this. I wish I had done it. What is it that I love about it? Yeah. How do you do that?
Yeah. I think that fear sticks in your mind when you're like browsing other artists. Like you come upon somebody's work, you're like, I kind of just wish I could embody this feeling I'm getting from that artist. But when I sit down to actually work, I try to just not recall anything specifically and just let these things be like vague impressions in your mind. So that way you're kind of free to create, and you're going to call upon them naturally. They're in the way like, you might wake up from a dream but not remember it, but like mood will have been influenced by it, and it'll kind of like guide the course of your day maybe. I feel like visual art can be like that. When I sit down to work, I never try to be afraid that I'm doing something like somebody else. I'm always open to like an impression I get. So, until today, when you asked me, you're like, let's talk about Mary Blair. I'm like, well, for my sake, let me narrow it down to a specific thing and try to tie it to a project of mine. So as soon as I took this aquarium drift book I wrote and then had the Peter Pan thing, I'm like, oh, wow, this project totally follows kind of like the rhythmic beats of her art through her creative process behind that. And I didn't think of that when I made that book. And I made it like 4 years ago, and that never even occurred to me. But now that you kind of like bring it up, like, oh yeah, here's a project of mine that totally fits her work. And I don't feel like I was copying her in any way, because, there's big parts of my style that are very different from hers, but I could easily kind of show somebody how that work has influenced mine. And it's always like just kind of a deeper level of like the mood and the tone of it. You can see it in my work, even if visually that it's not quite exact, right? So, yeah.
Cool. Well, where can people find you online?
Well, I teach on Skillshare, so you can learn from me there, and you can just go to iramarcks.com, and I've got a bunch of my books for free to listen to and read. And I'm on Instagram mostly.
Cool. Yeah, and you were talking earlier, I don't know if it was during our interview time or just when we were pre-chatting, but you were talking about a class where you look at other artists a lot. I think that might be of interest to the people watching this one. Can you talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah. If you want to take another look through the history of art and how it kind of how it can influence your art, I have a class called Illustration by Design that looks at the era of Art Nouveau and a lot of that balance of how illustrators can use design techniques to guide their work and make it stronger.
Great. Sounds good. Thanks, Ira.
Yeah. Thanks.